Hi everyone. Welcome back. So we start with the first student presentation of this workshop. Tanveen Randhawa is a PhD student at the Center for Ecological Sciences. The topic of the presentation is role of trait variation in bistable systems.
Thank you. Am I audible? So I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Vishwesha Guttal, who is my supervisor and also my lab, and IISc for funding my PhD. As Vishu mentioned, the topic of my talk is the role of trait variation in a savanna-woodland bistable system. Now, to start with the talk, I would just like to go over this quote by Alfred Russel Wallace, where he says that if in a rainforest, the traveler notices a particular species and wishes to find more like it, he must often turn his eyes in vain in every direction. Trees of varied forms, dimensions, and colors are around him, but he rarely sees any of them repeated. Time after time, he goes towards a tree which looks like the one he seeks, but a closer examination proves it to be distinct. While Wallace here talks about how distinct individuals are among species, we see a lot of variation even within species, and this has been shown by a large number of studies that have come up in the last decade. Now, considering that there's so much variation in nature within species and between species, we ask the question, what happens when individuals differ from each other in a bistable system? Bistability is something that we have talked about a lot in the last, in the last 1 week. So the bistable system that is this better? Yeah. So the bistable system. Yeah. So the bistable system that I will be talking about in particular is the Savanna-woodland system. So just to, so the two stable states in this system are savannas and woodlands. And just for the sake of definition, think of a continuum where you have all grasses at one end, such as in a grassland, and you have all trees at the other end. So savannas would be defined as a system which has an intermediate level of grass. And by definition, savannas are biomes which have a continuous layer of grass and a discontinuous layer of trees. And these systems are frequently disturbed by fires. So in this talk, whenever I mention woodlands, I am considering systems which have a discontinuous layer of grass and a more or less continuous layer of trees. Now, looking at the bistability in this system, many studies have shown that as rainfall is increased, so considering a certain level of rainfall, as shown on the x-axis in this graph, and the units here are just arbitrary. So and I show the grass cover on the y-axis, and here the grass cover is in the proportion covered by grass in the landscape. So at very low rainfall, you see that the grass cover is almost 100%, which is similar to what you see in a grassland ecosystem. And as rainfall in this system is increased, we move towards more of a savanna system where you still have a continuous layer of grass, but the tree cover is not continuous. But at very high rainfall cover, say somewhere between 1.6 and 1.6 and 2 in this plot, you see a woodland system being occupied. And at intermediate levels of rainfall, say between 0.4 to 1.2, you see both of these systems coexisting, which looks somewhat like this in the real world. So when you look at these sites and the frequency distribution of tree covers in such sites at a mean annual precipitation of say 2100 mm, you see that the tree cover is found in with much higher frequency at like 20 and 80%, while the rest are much rarer in the system. So now given, so now we have seen a lot of studies which account for alternative stable states and alternative biome states, but we see that individual variation is largely ignored in such studies. And studies have speculated that incorporating individual variation and traits can also reveal novel dynamics in such systems. And some studies have also shown and speculated that higher trait variation may increase or decrease the probability of tipping events. And especially for such a system, which is so widely distributed and is important not just for biodiversity, but also for human populations that depend on it, it's, I think, important that we look into the role of variation in such systems. So in the current work, I'll be describing the model that we use for trait variation, introducing trait variation, the methods that we use for the same, and the results that we get. So particularly what I'll be talking about is what happens, say, for the, what happens to the, say, the bistability regime, bistability region. Does it shrink, or does it become much broader? And does it shift in any of these directions? So for this study, we have used the model given by Staver and Levin in their 2012 AMNAT paper. And the model considers three functional plant types. So the grasses, so the three functional types are grasses, savanna tree saplings, and savanna tree adults. And the proportion cover of each of these types adds up to 1. So in a sense that space is considered implicitly in this model. And this is a mean field model. And the equations, the ordinary differential equations here are, I'll just explain briefly. Say the saplings are born at a rate beta by replacing grasses. Saplings transition to these trees at a rate omega g, and they die at a rate mu, which is immediately occupied by, the space is immediately occupied by grasses, and trees die at a rate nu similarly. Now, the interesting part in this system is how each of these functional types interact with fire. When it comes to grasses, so fire needs grass to spread, so that at low grass cover, fire cannot spread. So it's very essential for these systems that there is grass. When it comes to saplings, in an event of fire, they lose their above ground biomass, but they resprout quickly. Now, as the saplings are growing, and as they attain a certain height or accumulate a certain bark thickness, they become these adults. That's what I mean by adults in this context. They become these adults which are resistant to fires. So they no more experience mortality because of fires. And this transition rate that I had mentioned, omega g, now as you can see that, so omega g refers to the transition rate of savanna saplings to adults. And at low grass cover, you would find that there is less frequency of fire and less fire spread. So you'll see a higher probability of seeing these adults. Whereas when you have low grass cover, you see a lower probability of saplings transitioning into adults. And so the saplings sort of get trapped in this stage. So what we do in our study is we take these three parameters and we introduce variation in them. And we assume that the traits are heritable. That is, we only consider genetic variation in the model. Here specifically, we introduce a parameter called theta, such that now omega g becomes a function of both grass cover and theta. Theta we define as the resistance of fire, and the trait that so in the real world, if the trait, what is the trait that we would be looking at would be, say, the bark growth rate. This is the mathematical form of that. So now consider there are 3 individuals which have different levels of resistance to fire. For individuals which have a low theta level, even at high grass cover, even at an intermediate grass cover, say 0.4, such individuals do not transition to adults. Whereas individuals which have a higher level of theta, even at higher grass cover and higher fire frequency, say 0.6, they do transition to trees. So the no variation model now, so in the no variation model, we had 3 ODEs. But if we consider, say, there are n individuals in the system now we have 2n plus 1 ordinary differential equations. And this is how we model the system. So how do we introduce variation in this? We first consider, we fix the number of types and say there are 10 types with different ranges of trait values. So a high variation in the system would be, say, a higher range of values, say going from 0 to 1, whereas a low variation would refer to something going from 0.3 to 0.7, a shorter range. And we also look at what is the role of different distributions on this. And for to start the simulation, we only vary 1 trait at a time. So I'll be going over the results in this, talking about different levels of the dynamics. So considering just the ecosystem level of the dynamics, say when we have variation in sapling death rate, which is mu, if you follow the green curve here, the solid green curve, it represents the mean field model. And as you can see in the mean field model, you have the highest range, highest region of bistability in the system. But when you go, when you increase the variation in the system has a much thinner range. The bistability region essentially shrinks. And what that means is that now the grassland state exists for a much narrower range of sapling birth rate or rainfall. And this is something that we see even for other traits that we vary in the system, that is tree death rate or sapling death rate. Now looking at the population level dynamics, by population, I mean the set of all the saplings and trees in the system. So if I just look at the woodland regime, it is a monostable region in this bifurcation diagram, and I pick a certain level of sapling birth rate and look at what happens at this point. So what we do is we start with different initial grass covers and we see what is the distribution of different traits in this system. So when we vary sapling death rate, and I start with an initial distribution of this kind, where all the tree types are in equal proportion, we see that even for different initial grass covers, we see that the sapling death rate, which is the lowest, is the one that sort of survives in the population. So, and this is something that is also seen for the trait tree death rate, that the sapling type or the tree type, which has the highest survival rate, sort of survives. Now, when we come to the variation in sapling resistance to fire, I again start with the same initial distribution. Now we find a different distribution in this case. For initial, and you can see that the distribution is a little more skewed towards higher values. So here I plot the solid green lines represent the steady state grass cover. So if you notice that all the tree types which have theta value or the sapling resistance to fire value, which is greater than this steady state grass cover, are present in the population. Whereas when I look at what is the role of the initial grass cover, we see that that the steady state grass cover essentially depends also on the initial grass cover, such that all the theta types which have theta value which is greater than the initial grass cover is present in the population, and the ones which are lower than that sort of decrease in their proportion. So we see that the mean value of the trait at steady state increases with with increase in initial grass cover. And this is sort of this is the graph for different initial grass covers. I mean, in the previous one, I just showed 3 starting points. So even though ecosystems might have an overall tree cover might be same for different ecosystems, you can have entirely different population compositions depending on the initial conditions of such systems. So I'll briefly talk about why this happens in the mechanism part. So in the no variation model, we see that if all conditions are maintained same, we see that the grass cover goes towards 1, which is the grassland state. Whereas when I look at the trait variation, the model in which we have variation, we see that tree cover is much higher than grass cover. And this is actually the woodland state. In the trait variation model, if I look at the individual proportions of which tree types are higher in proportion versus which are lower, we see that as soon as the simulations are started, you have individuals which have a sapling resistance to fire level greater than 0.5 immediately increase in their proportion. And the dashed line here represents the point when the grass cover sort of crosses the 0.45 level. And after that, you can see that other trees also, other saplings also start to transition to trees. So in conclusion, looking at how different traits respond to how different traits sort of change the dynamics, we find that high variation in both the cases can reduce bistability, but the final community, there's a mistake there. The final population composition varies with the initial conditions when you look at the trait that we mentioned, the sapling resistance to fire trait. And these studies, in general, overall, I think the importance of such studies is that you can identify traits that can significantly impact the dynamics of such systems. And something to look into such studies is, whether tracking the distribution of these traits and the changes in them can help better predict how these systems would respond to change, external changes. Thank you.
Any questions? Yeah. And then you, yeah. You have to wait for 3 seconds after turning it on.
Yeah. So no, I was just wondering, and not a question really, but I was just wondering if is the next step adding like something like adaptive dynamics to this kind of model, like evolving trait, or?
You can do that. We are not doing it, but we are looking at the role of space in this, because fire is a spatial process also.
Okay.
How fire spreads in the system is something that is, and how that could lead to spatial patterns in the system. But yeah, we can look at having.
So the variation of trait over space, you mean, in these kind of models, right?
Yeah. So
Okay.
the traits also vary over space, and
yeah.
But yeah, this adaptive traits could be a little, I think, mathematically complex, because the model itself is it's not very easy to work with. But we have looked at two different levels of, two different kinds of variation in the system. Like, there's another student from our lab, Dharni. She has looked at what happens when you have a trait that varies phenotypically versus when you have genetic variation.
Okay.
So that you can look at, but adaptive, yeah, it can get a little complicated.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, one question at the back.
This one or the yeah, same. Oh, the dg by dt. So so the thing is, each of these, so S refers to, I'll just explain you overall. So S here refers to all of these. S, T, and G are the proportion cover of each of these individuals. So here grasses take up the space that is sort of left after saplings and trees die. So they're not, so their reproduction is sort of not considered. It's just thought of as that any empty space in the system is immediately occupied by grasses. So their sort of their spread is infinitely fast, like. And
Can you switch on the mic, please?
So I want to know, why did you incorporate this linear combination of P1, U1, specifically that?
oh, here I am. Oh, it's just the summation of all of these. So each type would die. So P1 is the proportion of each type, and each type would die at a rate mu1, or say mu I or pi.
Right.
So it's just a sum of all of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah. How
So-
bistability reduces variation?
So essentially, I think, yeah. So what happens, I mean, if you look at the population level, you see that these, the sort of the best competitor in the system sort of takes over the whole dynamics. And they sort of, I mean, it's not, one second. So here, for example, in this, or I'll just show the population. If you remember the population level, at the population level, what happens is only these individuals survive while others are just eliminated from the system. So what happens is sort of these start driving the individuals which have the lowest sapling death rate or tree death rate sort of start driving the system while others are just eliminated. Although, for example, if I start my system with an individual, for example, if I have a no variation model where I start with only one kind of individual, which has a sapling death rate of 0.05, the bifurcation diagram is actually not same as the bifurcation diagram I see in this one. It's not exactly same. So variation does have some impact on that, but essentially it's just a not non-linearity. Are you saying, does it introduce some kind of non-linearity? Not in this case. In this also. So the thing is, in the case of sapling resistance to fire, you do see some different dynamics. It's also because there are these individuals which immediately transition to trees. And because they're transitioning to trees, the grass cover is decreasing in the system. So that sort of allows the other weaker competitors or other weaker types to now transition into adults.
Any other questions? If not, thank you, Tanveen, for a nice presentation. Next speaker is Smita. Can we